Dr. Jim Calcagno is a biological anthropologist with research and teaching interests in primate behavior, paleoanthropology, dental anthropology, and in general, evolutionary anthropology. He has conducted research in Denmark, England, Italy, Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda, as well as closer to home in Chicago. He has been a strong advocate of four-field anthropology and biocultural approaches to the study of humanity. Dr. Calcagno is also the founding director of the Loyola Fellowship Office, focusing on increasing the number and success rate of applications of Loyola students for prestigious national awards. His most recent research interests pertain to perhaps the most fundamental question of anthropology: what makes us human? He has an ongoing interest in the integration of evolutionary perspectives and biocultural approaches toward a better understanding of human natures and human cultures, and hopes that evolutionary anthropologists can provide useful ideas to anyone outside of his research perspective who's also interested in what makes us human. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Calcagno.
Thank you, everyone. In recent years, I've spent a considerable amount of time thinking about what makes us human, and my shift in research focus was the result of unexpected invitations and interactions with the theology department, most notably Anna Vegan and John McCarthy. Thus, I approach this opportunity today with great pleasure and also with even greater gratitude for encouraging me to think more outside my own subdiscipline. I also thank everyone for involved in making this session possible, and for thinking that I may actually have something to say of interest to you. We'll see. Regardless, given this event is sponsored by the Center for Catholic Heritage, I wish to open with a confession. I confess that despite my interest in what makes us human, I never delved into what theologians or philosophers or even other anthropologists have written about personhood. Thus, after my invitation to be a panelist, I've done some reading in these areas regarding what is meant by the term, and frankly, now I'm even more confused. On the plus side, I do have a better understanding of why I didn't connect with the term. Regardless, I'll begin with a quick summary of my limited review of the literature, then note why I never connected with personhood, and we'll conclude with my own answer to the question, what makes us human? My brief survey of personhood was made easy by two publications. The first is by Dr. Laura Appel Warren. In 2014, published Personhood, an examination of the history and use of an anthropological concept. Here she writes, in the foreword is written, understanding how a society defines personhood is essential for understanding how ethics, inequalities, and processes of human development work in that society. It is no wonder then that the concept of personhood has been one of the central theoretical concepts of anthropology. But then she says, yet despite or perhaps because of the ubiquitous use of the term personhood in anthropological studies, there has been little agreement about what the term means and how it should be used analytically. So I appreciate what Tom said at the start about defining terms, because my initial thought, my immediate thought after reading that last phrase was, that's a problem. And my next thought was, central concept in anthropology? Really? Who knew? Because anthropology really isn't about individuals very much, it's about culture. So I was perplexed, but fortunately I had this entire book in front of me, dedicated to answering the question from someone who not only began studying personhood in 1982, but both of her parents were cultural anthropologists. Clearly, once I read this book, I will know what personhood is, so I skipped toward the end to find the answer. She actually does provide a lengthy definition, but I feel the main thrust is covered in the first two sentences. Personhood is an analytical term used by anthropologists who, within any given culture, is considered to be either a fully functioning and accepted member of adult society, or in the case of children, who is considered to being on the way to being a fully functioning and accepted member of adult society. Personhood thus entails the attainment of physiological, psychological, and social competence as it is defined by a given culture. That highlights my own. 3 immediate thoughts about that definition popped into my mind. First, my mother wasn't a fully functioning adult for the last 5 or 6 years of her life, but I still granted her personhood. So maybe that sentence should read fully functioning or accepted member rather than and. Second, I then had a problem with my own redefinition because many Americans consider their dog or cat to be an accepted member society. Third, regardless of my own and or wording dilemma, I translated her definition to read, personhood is when people around you think you're a person. But don't trust me, because Dr. Appel Warren had spent 34 years studying this topic while literally growing up under an anthropological tent, while I spent 34 minutes on her book and grew up under an ecological stench of tire factories. In any case, in her concluding chapter, she wrote, I have left one question unanswered. Why is the study of personhood and the related concepts of person, self, and identity such a minefield of confusion, conflation, and obfuscation? Well, I think that question just answered itself. She admits at the end that we still have a long way to go, and I'll admit that if she can't convince everyone how to define personhood after 34 years of research, I sure can't do so during my 15 minutes of fame here. That brings me to the work of our keynote speaker, Dr. Jaworski. I visited his website and found an excerpt from his 2011 book, Chapter 12, Persons. And I immediately thought, praise the Lord. Another person has done all this work for me. Put it all out there. Now, for any students in the audience, this overall effort of mine does not constitute thorough background research by examining 2 main sources, but judging from his picture, he looked like a nice guy who I felt I could trust, and I'll have more on that later. After reading the chapter, it was obvious to me why he was invited here, and it's not just because of his outstanding scholarship. For when dealing with counter-arguments, the man clearly has the patience of Job. In review of different philosophical perspectives, he begins one section with, animalism claims that people such as you and I are animals. I was with him so far. That kind of philosophy, that's my kind of philosophy right there. Right? But then he went on to note, critics of this position include substance dualists and non-organismic dual attribute theorists. And I went, wait. There are critics of this argument? There are critics of the statement that we are animals? Clearly, I lack both the patience of Job and Jaworski to suffer through such arguments, as I would label such critics perhaps as substance abusers. These critics argue that we cannot be animals because our persistent conditions are psychological, and the persistent conditions of animals are not. So I consulted with my buddy, pictured here, to ask whether animals have psychological lives. Fortunately, he didn't bite my face off, but shrugged and said, maybe I should ask these guys. And then this mother who never read sociobiology textbooks on how to move on quickly if an infant dies was silent on the issue. But it gets worse. There's another philosophical camp, I've learned, that even claims that people do not exist. Dr. Jaworski details their position. Again, how scholarly polite can one man be? I just want to meet these folks and say, so if you're not a person, when you go to a conference to present this idea, do TSA agents just think something went by? Sense that, do you even pack clothes? So that's my admittedly impatient review of anthropology and philosophy of personhood. I still encourage trying to integrate insight from diverse fields of study, but if I have to debate whether we are animals or whether we are people, well, count me out. Regardless, my review did give me more insight into why my focus on what makes us human lacked personhood. But before I outline my own answer to that big question, please consider the following. The first Neanderthal fossil known to science generated an immediate controversy that I once thought would never end. Did Neanderthals interbreed with modern humans? This is too long of a story to cover in this talk, so I'll just say yes, they did, a little bit, as evidenced by Ancestry.com making a ton of money off people who want to know if they are part Neanderthal. While countless monographs and journal articles were devoted to the origin of modern humans, what was commonly missing was an answer to the main question: what exactly does a modern human look like in the fossil record? Of course, the basic assumption was that it should look like us: small brow ridges, big brains, rounded head, small teeth, and so on. And maybe it would do some fancy cultural things, like draw pictures in caves or have sewing needles to avoid looking like you didn't just strap a carcass on your back. But consider one of my favorite Neanderthal brutes, known as Shanidar 1. This guy was in his 40s when he died. He lived about 50,000 years ago, and a skeleton tells us that he survived long after half of his arm was amputated. He was probably blind and at least had severely impaired vision. His ankles were severely damaged and arthritic, and a recent analysis of his ear canals indicated that he was likely deaf long before his death. No wonder these guys went extinct, right? Except for the reason we have so much of this individual to analyze is because he was buried with grave goods and possibly colorful flowers. It's hard to imagine a hunter-gatherer being more unable to hunt or gather, given his conditions. This one-armed, deaf, blind, arthritic, and hobbled senior citizen of his generation. Yet by all indications, he was buried with dignity, perhaps prepped for the afterlife with tools by his side, most likely by close kin and good friends. It seems so human. So fossils reveal amazing things about human evolution, but they can't tell us what makes us human. And you can't judge a human by its cover, past or present. From an evolutionary perspective, it's unsurprising that the traits that make us human can appear in our lineage long before any fossil appears to look just like us, or any archaeological material evidence is present to indicate their abilities or their activities. Anatomically modern humans were surely preceded by emotionally, psychologically modern humans. We'll never know if Neanderthals prayed at their burial ceremonies, or at least bowed their big ugly heads, because evidence for cathedrals and temples will appear on the scene much later. Regardless, this is a lengthy way to say that I can't test if Shanidar 1 or any other fossil or any non-human primate has a sense of personhood,